Well, hey there, I'm Dr. Tom Ulrich, and I like to talk about leadership and engineering. But since I got these two little guys, I also like to talk about Scrum. Well, hey, I'm here today with my two friends. This is Nike and this is Cone, and we're going to talk some more about Scrum. Now, in today's video, what I'd like to talk about is whether or not you really use Scrum. And what I mean by that is I've seen a lot of places as I go to visit various engineering organizations, I'll hear managers who say things like, we use Scrum, and then they'll maybe take me over to where they're having their daily Scrum, and they'll say, see, we use Scrum, and I'll say, oh, so where's how long are your sprints? And they'll look a little confused, and I'll say, well, where's your sprint backlog? And they'll look more confused, and I'll say, well, where's your product backlog? And now they're completely lost. And what it is they've heard the word Scrum, they start having a meeting called Scrum, and they conclude that they're using Scrum. See, the confusion is the methodology is called Scrum, and one of the many things you do when doing the methodology of Scrum is you have a daily Scrum. So there are whole books on Scrum. Here's one by Ken Rubin. This is the first one you probably ought to read. And if it takes a book of that size to describe Scrum, I assure you there's more to it than simply having a daily meeting. By the way, in the case I just mentioned, I sat in on one of the meetings and discovered they weren't even, all they were doing is having a meeting. It wasn't even a Scrum. I mean, the methodology of Scrum prescribes how you have those daily meetings, and they weren't doing that. So I think they just heard the word Scrum, wanted to jump on that bandwagon, and started telling people they do Scrum. So what I've done then is in my doctoral studies in leadership, one phenomena I've seen over and over again, and it's well documented in the research, is this phenomena where leaders kid themselves about how well they're doing at things. And this example of Scrum might be just one such example where they have a daily meeting, or more precisely, they start calling their existing daily meeting a Scrum, and now they tell themselves they're doing Scrum. So it's kind of silly. At any rate, so what I've attempted to do is I've put together a questionnaire. There's a link to it down below. And the idea of the questionnaire is it's 20 questions, and you score each one as a 1 or a 0. I thought that was fun because, initially Scrum is a software technique, so, 1s and 0s are a pretty big deal. But the idea is let's ask yourself these 20 questions and give yourself a score, and then we have some sense of, are we really doing Scrum, or are we just kidding ourselves? So the first question then is, does your team have a daily Scrum? So the example I gave, they would get 1 point. Spoiler alert, that's the only point they're going to get out of these 20. But the first one is, are you having a daily meeting that you call Scrum? The second question is, does your team operate in sprints? Now, sprint is a key concept in Scrum. It's a time box, and the idea is these sprints are 2 to 4 weeks, and at the end of every sprint, you have a potentially shippable product. So I'll have a whole video on how to do a Scrum. I'll have a whole video on how to do sprints. The third question is, does your team have a sprint planning meeting for each sprint? Now, the next question is a little different. Does your team have meaningful sprint planning meetings? See, I've seen plenty of sprint planning meetings that were pointless. The supervisor comes in, he tells everybody what to do, and they convince themselves that's called sprint planning. See, the idea of Scrum is it's a self-organizing team, and if you have a boss telling everybody what to do, that is not self-organizing, and that is therefore not Scrum. So are we doing a meaningful sprint planning meeting? Each sprint should be a sprint planning meeting. If you have a 2-week sprint, a cadence of every 2 weeks, you're going to have this planning every 2 weeks. If you have a cadence of every 4 weeks, 4-week time box, 4-week sprint, you'll have a sprint planning every 4 weeks. Next question is, does your team, at the end of every sprint, do you have a sprint retrospective? So that's where just the team, not the managers, not the observers, not anything else, the team who's doing the work gets together and talks about what did we do well, and let's write that down to make sure we keep doing it. what did we do poorly, and let's brainstorm some ideas how to do that better. So it's a time of self-reflection. Now, the next question is similar. At the end of every sprint, does your team have a meaningful sprint retrospective? See, I've seen plenty of retrospectives where they're just playing the game and just a few platitudes, and everybody feels obligated to say, my Scrum is wonderful. Well, if you're not getting to some real stuff and dealing with real issues and really identifying mistakes and all that, you're really not doing it meaningfully. Next question is, does your team have sprint reviews? Now, I didn't say demo. Now, the old school thinking was, at the end of a sprint, demonstrate what you have, and that's really not the idea of Scrum. You want to have a review. It's going to be you show the working product. See, at the end of every time box, you have a potentially shippable product, and you show it working. Now, the way I've seen this gone bad is people will stand up and say, see, I did a spreadsheet. I made some progress. See, I did a drawing. See, I did a PO. See, I did whatever. No, you've completely missed the point of Scrum. Scrum is you have a potentially shippable product. So what we want to inspect is, if it's a software team, show us the software. Show us the software working. And it's not just a demo, it's a review. Let's look at it. Let's gather critical comments from everybody. And when I say critical, I don't mean mean. I just mean let's not be afraid to give substantive feedback. Never in a mean way, but we do want to, give real feedback. Next question then is, does your team have meaningful sprint reviews? So the subtlety there is, are you getting real feedback, or again, are we just doing platitudes? Does your team have a sprint backlog? So when you plan the sprint, there's a list of tasks, there's hours for each one, and you have a clear idea of what you need to get done in this time box. Does your team is the whole team involved in creating the sprint backlog? So it's similar to the idea of sprint planning. The idea of a backlog is you have in some tool. I like Excel. I don't like a lot of the special Scrum tools. Just a list with actual hours, and was it done with the whole team as opposed to one strong-willed, sort of strong personality just telling people. It's a self-organizing team. You don't want to have the strong personality person running, roughshod over the whole team. The next one is, does your team have a product backlog? So there's two backlogs in Scrum. There's the product backlog and the sprint backlog. There'll be videos on sprint backlogs. There'll be videos from me on product backlogs. But for now, the question is, do you have a product backlog? So the sprint is the backlog for the current sprint. The product backlog is kind of like for the next couple of years kind of thing for the whole product. Did your team maintain a product backlog burndown? Is it not only that you have the backlog, but you're plotting it and using agile estimating to predict an endpoint? Was your whole team involved in estimating the product backlog? So it's one thing to have a backlog that some manager put together. It's a whole other thing that the team came up with it and the team together estimated it. And I'll have a whole video on how to estimate. Next one is your whole team involved in grooming the product backlog. The idea there is the first time you do it, you'll have something, it'll probably have some value, but maybe every sprint or two, you need to go back and go through that painful process of rethinking, revising estimates, figuring out what you missed, and so on. Does your team have a Scrum Master? I'll have a video on what that means, but if you don't have a Scrum Master, you're not doing Scrum. Does your team have a product owner? Likewise, if you don't have a product owner, you're not doing Scrum. Those are the two of the most important roles in Scrum. Here's a question. Has your company invested in formal training and certification? So as a minimum, your Scrum Master and product owner need to be formally trained. Really, you ought to get Scrum Alliance certification. I talked about that in the previous video, but bottom line is go to Scrum Alliance for certification. The best trainer on the market is Mike Cohn. You saw my puppets are named Nike and Cohn, and that's kind of a shout out to Mike Cohn. Has at least half of the people in your Scrum team read an entire book on Scrum? Now, the book I recommend is this one. There are other good ones. Here's a little bit older one, but it's I think a very telling question is, are people reading about this? And the final one is, does your team embrace Scrum? And what I'm getting at that, and you know what I mean, is it something like when you talk about Scrum, people are kind of roll their eyes and kind of, oh yeah, we do Scrum, or are people generally leaning in? Any rate, so score that thing up. There's 20 questions. Score those things up. I would say, if you get a score of 16 or higher, yep, you're using Scrum. If your score is between 12 and 15, I like your direction. You got a good vector. Keep going. You're not there. If your score is between 6 and 11, I think really you shouldn't tell people you're using Scrum. You're not. And, if you have 5 or less, you're just simply not using Scrum, and would be kind of shocking if you think you are. At any rate, so hopefully that helps. I'm Dr. Tom Ulrich. I'm the Engineering Leadership Guy. And if you would like to see more videos, you can go to tomulrichconsulting.com. You can, on YouTube, you can just type in Dr. Tom Ulrich. Hey, if you don't mind, give me a like. Maybe subscribe. If you have a comment, answer it. If you look at how many views I have, you'll realize, oh, yeah, I actually have time to answer every single comment. At any rate, thanks for watching. We'll talk to you next time.